scheint wichtig zu sein.
Hi, folks. Good morning. A very warm welcome to our first keynote address of the Excite 2022 conference. My name is Sinéad Hurley, and I am here to introduce this morning's speaker. I'm sure all of you will agree it's absolutely wonderful to be gathering here in person together again after so long apart. And I'm delighted that we also are retaining some of the innovation that was forced upon us during the pandemic. And so for the first time, we're actually also live streaming our keynote address. And so I'd like to also extend a warm welcome to the members of the Excite community who are joining us online. So for wherever you are in the world, you're here with us this morning too. For accessibility purposes, I'd like to start with an audio description of myself. I'm a white, cisgendered female. I have shoulder-length brown wavy hair. I'm wearing a white shirt and brown trousers. The reason I'm here with you this morning is that I'm a member of the Excite Annual Conference Programme Committee, the ACPC. And every year we get to do what really does not feel like work. We get to meet together and discuss and debate whose voices we believe our Excite community needs to hear from. And so for the last couple of years, I've pretty much not shut up about this person, and I'm delighted to welcome her here this morning. Not only because she's Irish and she's hilarious, and that always gets a vote from me, but because I believe everybody needs to hear from her. She is an inspirational role model, and she really challenges our thinking in how to do better and to create a better and more inclusive world for everyone. Sinéad Burke is a writer, an educator, and an activist. In 2020, she founded the accessibility consultancy Tilting the Lens, who work with clients, including global brands such as Netflix, Gucci, Pinterest, Starbucks, and Ralph Lauren, to create more accessible policies and practices, products and services, and places. Sinéad is a podcast host, she's a writer, she's written a children's book called Break the Mold. She is a member of Gucci's Global Equity Board, and she serves on the Irish President's Council of State. She has spoken on the TED stage as she gave a TED talk in 2017 on why design should include everyone. And I'm just absolutely thrilled and delighted that we get to hear from her this morning. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to the magnificent Sinéad Burke.
Good morning. Thank you for that overly kind introduction, Sinéad, and thank you to the Excite community for the welcome here today. I think this is the largest group of people I have seen for almost 3 years. Hello. For accessibility reasons, I'll also begin with a visual description of myself. I'm a white cisgendered woman who uses the pronouns she and her. I have brown shoulder-length hair. It's a little bit long at the moment, but don't mention it. I am wearing a blue, full-length, knitted, hexagon print Gucci dress, casual. Full length for a conference like this was an interesting choice. And I am visibly and physically disabled. I have achondroplasia, the most common form of dwarfism, but I describe myself as a little person. I stand at the height of 3 feet 5 inches tall, or 105 centimeters. And if we were doing this on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, you may not be aware of that visual difference, but it's incredibly obvious in person. I'm really honored to be meeting with you all today. When the team at Excite offered the invitation to be here, the rationale and the reason for saying yes was due to the influence in this room. Whether you are science communicators, cultural professionals, or lead in museum and institutions of that nature, you have the opportunity to create space for people to belong, and through your exhibitions, work, and communications, narrate who gets to be part of this world. The work that we do at Tilting the Lens is about building a more equitable and accessible world for everyone. And that's rooted in my lived experience, both as a disabled woman, but also as an educational professional. My background is in the classroom. I'm an elementary or primary school teacher by trade. Some of my best experiences have been working with 12-year-old boys in the inner city in Dublin, challenging their need to code switch between home and school. So my ambition for today is creating a broader understanding of language, vocabulary, and also opportunities around accessibility so that everybody can be part of the Excite community, not in a way in which they are just welcomed, but explicitly invited. So to start with context and vocabulary, I have a question for you. What's the opposite of disabled? Now, I'm conscious there are multiple languages in this room, and that may differ depending on the languages that you speak. But what's the first word that came to your head? Able. Any others? Normal. Thank you to the brave person at the back of the room, because that's the reality, right? We think about us and them. Or if you're me, us and them. But my opposite of disabled is non-disabled. Because as we think about the way in which language shapes our society, we don't just name objects, but we put boundaries around who gets to exist. I don't view disability as a bad or negative thing. But that's a shift we have to come to. Because whilst I self-identified as disabled at the beginning of this session, and we have sign language interpreters joining us on screen deliberately, because when we were participating in a conversation with Victor and the wider team at Excite, we asked if anybody had any access requirements and if there was a need for a sign language interpreter. They said no. How is there no need for a sign language interpreter in a room of this size? But also, how do we set up the infrastructure so that if somebody deaf did want to participate, it is the norm, and not by which they have to ask for an exceptional accommodation? We understand that in terms of a disability community, it's about 1 in 4 people. So my guess is at least a quarter of this room is disabled. But you may not feel comfortable identifying as disabled because in terms of the spectrum of disability, it is far wider than we initially perceive it to be. Because disability can be visible and invisible. It can be physical, learning, sensory. It can be a chronic illness. It can be mental illness. It can be neurodiversity. So if you have anxiety, looking at me on stage, welcome, you're disabled. If you have long COVID, welcome, you're disabled. If you've had cancer or a loved one has, or an eating disorder, or ADHD, or dyslexia, or OCD, or if you're autistic, all of those diagnoses fit within disabled, but due to what you perceive to be the opposite of disabled, people don't feel comfortable identifying. Disability can be inherited, like mine, or acquired, but it can also be accidental. How many of you ski? That is a disproportionate number of skiers in the room. How many of you have fractured a bone while skiing? It's most of the people who ski. How many of you were still able to go to work after you fractured a bone while skiing? 3 of you, no, 5. Disability is part of each of our lived experiences. It is the only identity group in which we are guaranteed to be part of throughout our lives. It is part of the human life cycle because I hope we each have the privilege of getting old or going skiing. This is not us and them, this is all of us. At any time. And that's not something to feel hindered by, but to be empowered by. And when we think about how language shapes our society, as science communicators and those who exist within cultural institutions, it's incredibly important that you have a stance on this, but understand that even as a community, the disabled community differs in terms of how they perceive it. So do you talk about impairment or disability? Do you talk about person first or identity first? Meaning, do you talk about disabled people or persons with disabilities? I'm really proud to be disabled. I would not be on stage in front of you today if I wasn't disabled. That is not because the only merit or value I hold is that I am useful in a photograph, or because I'm disabled. But that identity has shaped my perspective on the world and also my professionalism in the same way that my Irishness has. My womanhood had, my whiteness has, the way in which the world perceives me, and I the world. So I proudly describe myself as a disabled woman and would encourage you to shift your language from a nervousness to one of culture, community, and pride. Because the reality is, the reason why I asked the question as to what's the opposite of disabled, we have gone through these models of disability, and many of us in this room sit at a different part of the axis. As scientists, you often look to disability through a medical model. Your modus operandi is often to find fixes and cures. But who wants to be fixed? Who says? So how do we move from thinking no longer from eugenics to medical to charitable to social, but to one that's radical and formed around intersectionality and justice and equity? And how are you thinking through this model when you put together your work? Because the reality is we are not that far from the eugenics model. This is the American Eugenics Society. And what's on this poster talks about unfit human traits, such as feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, criminality, insanity, alcoholism, we won't talk about last night, pauperism, and many others run in families are inherited in exactly the same way as colour in guinea pigs. If all marriages were eugenic, we could breed out most of the unfitness in 3 generations. What is the opposite of disabled? Now, you may think the eugenics model was an incredibly long time ago, and it was. But the reason I wanted to speak on this stage now is because the pandemic was a mass disabling event, but also how we treated disabled people during the pandemic was incredibly problematic. If we look to our neighbours in the UK for the moment, 6 out of 10 COVID deaths in the UK were disabled people. Globally, disabled people went into hospital with COVID-19 with do not resuscitate orders because in a moment of limited resources, non-disabled people were valued more than disabled people. In the US, if you were a disabled person who went into hospital with your own ventilator, there was research that says that that ventilator was taken from that disabled person, given to a non-disabled person because their lives were worth more. All at the same time. Not one COVID press conference in the UK, for example, had a sign language interpreter. The Jubilee yesterday did have one, though. So how do we think about this? When we talk about language, often we feel like saying the wrong thing is so easy that we will just say nothing at all. Language around disability continues to evolve, but our move from the medical model to the justice one has meant that we've tried to limit our discomfort around language and come up with euphemisms. I'm not asking anybody to raise your hands, but how often in your programming do you talk about the differently abled or all abilities or special education programs for those with special needs? One of my call to actions for you as a group is, let's no longer use those euphemisms and proudly look to the word of disability. Because when we distance ourselves from the language, we underline our lack of commitment or consideration for this community. So let's not talk about differently abled, or challenged, or crazy, or blind spot, or deaf ears. Some of the words that I use, wild, all the time. Because you may not be affected by those conditions, but people who do are listening. So I think one of the standalone points that I want to speak to you today about is disability is not a negative word. Sinéad, if you don't mind me using an experience you shared with me earlier, Sinéad was telling me a story that her 4-year-old child was in a shop recently and came across somebody who looked like me. Is anybody a parent in this room or has a cousin, nephew, niece, child? Yes. So let's imagine that your child sees somebody who's different. What's the first thing they do? Stare. Point. Do they say anything? Yes, they can't help themselves. Ask questions. So what usually happens to me in that moment is like I'll be in a space, usually a supermarket, and a child will be like, look! And any of you have been in that experience, you're like, oh God, we need to leave this place immediately. So what you do as the adult? You distract them with something shiny on the shelf, and you're like, that's lovely, that person is different, but please look at this thing. And the child is like, no, that's really boring. Look, she's in a full-length Gucci dress in the middle of Heilbronn. And then the parent doesn't know what to say. so they say nothing. Instead of facilitating that curiosity in education and realizing that their own vulnerabilities is not a reason by which to not move forward, and say, yeah, that is a little woman. Why don't you say hello? Not that it's the responsibility of anybody and everybody who is diverse to facilitate that conversation just to exist, but we need to start somewhere in moving forward. So that child will say hi, I'll say, hi, I'm Sinead, and they'll go, oh, you're boring. I thought you would speak differently, I don't know. Have antenna? No? Oh, weird. And we'll go on about their day. But our practice as people, particularly often through a scientific lens, is to unfortunately be apathetic, not through intention, but through our own lived experience, because we don't want to cause harm. But the reality is we are prioritizing our own discomfort versus somebody else's inclusion. How do we not make it about us, but about them? And we can do that by facilitating the conversation. And we start with, disability is not a negative word. We're going to move forward to thinking about accessibility in just a moment, but before we do and leave this section, I want to be really clear, particularly in a room like this, how important intersectionality is. What we are seeing now in terms of a movement from cultural spaces, in terms of the inclusion of disabled people, is co-design, which Sinéad and I are going to speak to later. But we need to ensure that as we do include disabled people, you are not just including those who fit the most normative definition of disability. You have a white cisgendered male wheelchair user who's straight, great, happy pride. But we need to look to the research of Kimberly Crenshaw, which talks about the ways in which our different identities intersect and the importance of those who are multiply marginalized to be part of this conversation. We need to think broader. And the rationale of coming to speak with you today is that I can't tell you the amount of exhibitions and science conversations that I have been part of where people tell me it's accessible. And what they usually mean is available, or affordable, or that there's a ramp. So how do we rethink the definition of accessibility to be more broad? At our company, Tilting the Lens, this is the one that we are working to that's continuously iterating. We believe it to be an evolving practice, one that includes the intersectional participation of those who've lived experience of exclusion. It must be key to each stage from the very beginning, not as an afterthought or as something that is consultative. It must be designed with disabled people, not for disabled people. And true accessibility builds inclusion, equity, agency, creativity, innovation, and pride. But whilst you are cultural institutions or scientists, you also need to ensure that your funding models are secure. So there is a business case to be doing this, because often we say, well, it's the right thing to do. It is. But if we don't make this part of the business of the organizations that we work within, we will never have capacity or resources or time to make this meaningful. So the reality is that 1 billion people live with a disability. It's the same size of the population as China, over 15%. But we know that through the CDC in the US, long COVID is now considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if I was to ask who has had COVID in this room and who continues to have implications from that, many more of you would be disabled than you might first identify. We also know that the disabled population is $1.9 trillion US per year, bring in their family and friends in terms of their spending power, and it's about $7.9 trillion US per annum. But the stark reality is that disability and disabled people have an unemployment rate of 28.8%, lower than that of non-disabled people. So regardless of where you come from in the world, it is most likely that 50 to 75% of disabled people are unemployed. And my ask of you today is that when we think about accessibility, it's not useful to just think about this from a visitor perspective. Because that visitor may enter into your space for 1 hour in a year. This is about recruitment. This is about succession planning for your organization. This is about creating spaces for everyone. I got to have a great conversation at the gala dinner last night, which I was overdressed for. Crystals in Heilbronn, it was a look. which was thinking about the ways in which we consider accessibility through these cultural institutions in a way that's more than buildings. And I have some ideas for that later on. But in terms of the final rationale about the business case, we know that according to Forbes, $10 billion is going to be prioritized to organizations that look to accessibility through a creative process in the next 3 to 5 years. And now everybody's favorite, the legal aspect. Because what we know from an accessibility perspective is that often we only think about this through compliance. We look to the standards. What was supposed to be a starting point is often considered the end point, and disabled people are expected to just accept that in terms of their access. But it might be worth a reminder of what it actually looks like legally, because we often talk to compliance, not realizing the wider remit that's there. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, museums have to provide equal access and service to their venues for all audiences. Employees are not referenced. Collaborators are not referenced. But also, what does equal mean rather than equitable? Because if we run a race in these heels, in this dress, equal is that we all start at the same time. Equitable is that I get a head start. So what does it look like in terms of the law and practice and reality? And a very long slide, but the EU has adopted the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which says that disabled people have a right to participate in cultural institutions. But what we know is that in terms of the impact of the world around us, disabled people are often fighting for healthcare, access to education, that the idea of entertainment is an idyllic panacea that we never reach. But how do we move from compliance to creativity? I think this is where we consider the moral obligation. And this is my rationale for speaking with you today. Museums and cultural institutions shape society. Your venues create experiences and conversations. Whom we open these buildings up to and invite in defines who we include in society at large. Can anybody remember the first time they went to a science exhibition? There's more of you than you think, because otherwise you wouldn't be doing this job. Was it a good experience? My guess is yes, because again, you're doing this job. How many of you could have been in this room, but aren't in this room because that wasn't a good experience? Whether that's because they couldn't get in the front door and had to go around the back entrance, whether that's because in terms of the material that was happening on the walls or in the space, it wasn't the right font, it wasn't the right size, or that actually in terms of the representation of their lived experience, it was problematic. My guess is this is a room of people who have had a positive experience, mostly within this space. How do you use that privilege to create space for others? So we have a bit of a framework that we work to, which is about looking to a system of awareness, advocacy, policy, culture, and system. Awareness because we don't know what we don't know. And creating space for our own learning. Advocacy, because this isn't just one person's responsibility in an organization or in a project, but is everybody's. Policy, because if it's not part of the day-to-day practice of you as an individual scientist or as a person who works in a museum, this becomes optional. Culture, because what you do in those spaces creates permission for others. And system. I'm going to pick on Brad, because he and I spoke at dinner last night. And he was telling me that in terms of the UK and London, that often the directors of all of those cultural institutions come together. We were talking about accessibility and the limitations of being in historic and protected buildings. And I said, great. Why don't you all come together and challenge Westminster to do better? I'm putting poor Brad on the spot. But why do we limit what we think our power is? Well, probably because we've been told to. But can you imagine if all of the leaders in this room said, you know what? We no longer want policy and legislation to be a hindrance about the spaces we can occupy and who we get to enter. We really want to reimagine accessibility from a historical perspective. It has been done. But we want to create a space for everyone. I'm not sure all of the governments in the world could exclude all of you together. But the challenge with this work is that it's often individuals going up against the system. What about if the system was the advocate? Because that's where the innovation opportunity comes in. I'm often intrigued by cultural spaces. My colleagues and I went to see a play in London about 4 weeks ago in the Almeida Theatre in North London. Amazing space. The play had a full-size working swimming pool on stage. I know. For a 4-week production. You know what the building didn't have? A lift. We can get a flying helicopter on stage at Miss Saigon, but no lift. Wild. And the same in the spaces that we occupy. We can often put, I imagine, a full working rocket in a space museum, but we can't imagine a beautiful ramp. Because again, we think about this through the medical model and from compliance, rather than using all of those creative skills that exist. So I want you to just take you through a timeline that I would love for you to consider. And we're looking to this specifically around the visitor journey. But we can look to it when we speak to Sinéad, thinking about how you engage with different stakeholders from a science perspective. So marketing. Let's do a quick checklist. In terms of your branding, is a color contrast accessible? If you don't know the answer to that, please spend your free afternoon inquiring. In terms of your social media posts, do all of your images have alt text? Is all of your videos captioned as a policy standard in multiple languages? For anything specific, do you have audio descriptions? Do you have intersectional representation in any marketing that you present to the world, including visibly and invisibly disabled people? Website and ticketing. How accessible is it? I've just come back from the Venice Biennale, casual, which is fully accessible. But even the English website I couldn't buy tickets on because it was still in Italian. I had to hand it to my colleague Michael, and I was like, just tell me, I've spent 40 minutes. Which one do I need to buy? How do we think about that? Do you have a CAPTCHA on your ticketing facility? If you have a CAPTCHA, it's inaccessible to anybody who's blind or low vision or autistic who uses screen readers. What you think may be a security is also inaccessible for others. In thinking about your website, is it beyond compliance? When's the most recent time you've audited it? Thinking about transportation. Do you offer information to potential visitors and guests about where the local transportation is? Is it accessible? If you're looking to public transport, does it have step-free access? Where are you located, or are we assuming that everybody has the information that they need and the resources to do so in order to be able to get to you? In terms of your building, what information are you providing? As organizations, we often don't talk about our level of accessibility. Why? Because it highlights our level of inaccessibility. So we are reluctant to say we have a lift because we have 3 concrete steps out the front. Or we are reluctant to say that we have a lift, but it only actually goes to 2 galleries. It doesn't go to the top floor where this exhibition is. But again, we are prioritizing our own embarrassment rather than somebody else's access. And we say to people, what level of accommodations do you need, without ever articulating what we're willing to provide. Communication is the biggest key to accessibility. And the wonderful thing about this venue is you're all science communicators. So how do we begin to communicate what is available and what isn't, rather than othering people and expecting them to do the work in order to be able to participate? The same with the exhibition space. Have you been using the Smithsonian accessibility guidelines to look to the type font, to look to the height and the size of the type font? At what point should resources be hung? I love going to exhibitions, but being 3'5" tall is always a challenging experience because everything is hung at a point in which there is a reflection on the glass, so I see nothing. So I often have to look at things from a 6-foot gap or look through a photograph from somebody else. And that's not just about me, but that's any child who visits a space, or a wheelchair user, or somebody who's older. How are we thinking about that? And lastly, accessible tools and technology. We're working on a program at the minute where we are participating with a San Francisco-based startup called IRA, for people who are blind or low vision. So if you are an IRA user, you log into the app on your phone and you're connected to a real-life person in multiple languages 24/7. that person, through your phone, can look out the back camera and guides you through a space. Can you imagine if you had that available for every exhibition or every project so that it was equitably accessible for people who are blind or low vision? Transformative. But as I said earlier, accessibility is not just important for your visitors. It is also important for artists, scientists, and researchers, because when we talk to projects around disability or accessibility, we make the assumption that they are non-disabled led with support from those communities. We talk about stakeholder engagement rather than equitable design and participation from the outset. But it's also about employees and visitors. How much talent are we missing out on, particularly with the Great Resignation, because disabled people can't access your spaces? As part of doing this conference, it was really important that we had a remote and virtual option for this session, because we all have the privilege to feel safe in this space. Lots of people with chronic illnesses, particularly, do not. So there may have been many people who have been your colleagues over the past 2 years who are now in a difficult position as we all go back to work, who may not feel safe. So how do we think about that? And we start with this. I'm conscious that this may be a phrase that you are already very familiar with. Nothing about us without us, which comes from the disability justice community, specifically Black, queer, disabled people. But what we have found is that this has been misinterpreted. What has now happened is nothing about us without us has meant that we include disabled people or those who are at the margins of society at specific parts of our work, rather than them having equal decision-making from the very outset all the way through. So I want to share some examples that I think are really interesting, but I'm very conscious that there is enormous expertise in this room. I don't doubt that many of you are doing this work in smaller and larger organizations and projects. Our email is readily available. I would love to learn from you. And if we can support you in that process, please do call on us. I realize putting an image of the Mona Lisa and a disabled person is tricky this week, but this person is actually disabled. There was only a quiet murmur. I feel like I need to explain that, or it's too soon and people are reeling. So earlier this week, a visitor who attended the Louvre dressed themselves as an older person and used a wheelchair to get closer to the Mona Lisa and rubbed cream on the glass prosthetic. Problematic. Also not great representation of disabled people and access in a cultural space. But what we know is that the Museo Nacional del Prado held an exhibition called Touching the Prado, which included 6 3D touchable renderings. So how do we think about different types of users and experiences? But also, if you're putting together an exhibition or a space, do you have a 3D map that somebody can feel their way through, that you can share with them in the post, or you can send them the rendering and they can 3D print it themselves if that's an option that they have, so that the first time they're not coming into the space, it doesn't feel like an unknown? In terms of the Tunbridge Wells Museum and Art Gallery, they created a toolkit to give guidance to small and medium-sized museums about engaging with visitors living with dementia. And I think that toolkit is really exceptional and key, because I don't doubt that there's a number of individuals and organizations who have such resources in this room. Share them. Because if we're all trying to reinvent the wheel, we will only get so far in this process, so let's learn from each other. And the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, which was established by the Act of Parliament in 2018, is now one of the world's most accessible museums, thinking through a very holistic lens, that it is by design rather than an afterthought. And lastly, Benningborough Hall made a Grade 1 listed building more accessible, because often we talk about the concrete steps or the staircase from 1920. But when do we stop putting buildings before people? When do we stop saying architecture, my apologies to the architects in the room, is more important than access? That our visual landscape has more value than potentially allowing disabled people to access? Why does that not make us uncomfortable? Why do we say something beautiful is more important than agency? I don't think the solution is deconstructing every architecturally protected building that exists. I think we just have a responsibility to imagine what access could look like. Because we design a ramp to be ugly, silver, metal, and not beautiful. Hands up if you've been to the Guggenheim in New York. Anybody know what the Guggenheim is? What Frank did? It's a ramp. But we don't think of it as a ramp because Frank Lloyd Wright is a very impressive architect who built a spiral. It's a ramp. You know what a fashion runway is? It's a ramp. So why can we imagine it beautifully in some circumstances, but when we think about disabled people, we cannot? That is our bias. That is our belief that disabled people are less valuable than others. Let's challenge it. So in terms of it, what's needed as a solution is a holistic approach. This is why we work through people, places, products, and promotions. So let's think about your recruitment strategy for just a second. Whether you are bringing on stakeholders onto a science-based project or you're a cultural institution, at what point do you ask people, do they have access accommodations? When they get the job? Or do you ask them and provide it in the job description? Because guess what? Most of you are probably not creating accessible Word documents or PDFs, so the job description itself is not accessible, or your website isn't. In terms of thinking about places, we spoke to this. How can you provide information that gives people insight into what can be expected? In terms of products, whether that's exhibitions or whether that's new drugs, which I think Maeve and I are going to talk about, how can you ensure it's equitable? And in terms of promotion and your marketing, how are you thinking about it from the very beginning? Because we know that you may think of this as a cost. We need to move to a mindset that this is an investment, a long-term investment for who we want to be. But if we don't do this by design, it's 40 to 100% more expensive to do it afterwards. So I'm going to stop hogging the mic soon. But in advance, wanted to share with you some takeaways. Disability is not a negative word. Please say the word disabled. Don't use euphemisms, but do create space for other disabled people to be able to self-identify with language that's comfortable for them. Create with disabled people, not for disabled people. The disabled community is not a monolith. Most other little people disagree with me, as is their right. I think they're wrong. No, I'm joking. Intersectionality must be a value and a pillar to this work. Our attempts at inclusion should not be othering by design. I'll give you an example of this. It's going to be a fashion example. My apologies. Those who define themselves or fat or plus-sized have been speaking to the fashion industry for such a long time, be it luxury or fast fashion, looking for options in what it is that they want to wear. The fashion industry said, sure, we'll give you options, 6 of them. They'll all be grey. There'll be no tailoring. They'll be down the back of the store with a big sign that says plus-sized, you're welcome. For anybody who's had to experience that, what is it like going through that store? To go down to the very dark corner to find items that were chosen for you without any lived experience as part of the process. You then have to go to a changing room that is not designed for you. It is so undignified. And often in science, we experience the very same process. I cannot tell you the amount of appointments that I have been to as a child all the way through to my adolescence when the doctor comes in and says, I'm just going to bring a few students. Is that okay? They've never seen anybody like you before. And I'm like, sure, I'm 4. I have no real agency or autonomy here, but yeah, let me do my gait analysis for all of you and you just look at me. Where is the gap between education, communication, progress, and agency? Let's not other by design. Even if our intentions are good, the process might not be. Everybody should leave this space today with this question. Asking at every possible opportunity, is this accessible? Taking the broadest definition of what accessibility could mean. And then ask yourself, who is not in the room? As you begin to think about Excite next year in Paris? No. Where are we next year? Malta. Even better. No offense to Paris. We have work to do for the Paralympics. Call me. How do you think about Malta next year, ensuring that there are lots of people who are not in the room over these 3 days, part of the fabric of Excite? Not just on stage, not just giving the keynote, but participants like all of you. And it's easy to think about that in a conference in advance. But wherever you go home to, how do you do that in your own work too? I'm very conscious that I have just lectured you for 40 minutes with brief moments of humor. That was mostly at my own expense. But I now have the great privilege of welcoming Sinéad back on stage, and I just want to thank you so much for your time and engagement, and I really do feel like this is such an important room, and the idea of what you will do over the next decade and the ways in which you will create space for people to belong is a huge honor and privilege. Gur míle maith agaibh. Thank you so much. Also, can we take one moment to thank Victor, who has been doing such exceptional work, and I know that he is not the only member of the Excite community who has been doing this, but can we give a warm round of applause, should that be accessible to you, to the whole organizing committee. Oh. I know that for some people this is their full-time job, and for many others they have lots of other commitments too. To bring this many people together and to facilitate this is no small feat. And I know we had a bunch of very demanding requests, so I'm very grateful, and congratulations to the Excite community. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Thanks. Thanks so much. I think it's evident how moving and important that speech was, and thank you so much. We're going to have some questions from the audience.
Yes.
We have some microphones moving around. So if there are any questions for Sinead, please raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you as quickly as we can.
And be brave. Ask anything you want. We're happy to talk about the Met Gala or science and co-design.
Absolutely.
But if you have thoughts and comments, add them too.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start while we wait for anyone who has questions to make themselves known. You mentioned something about science fixing disability, and we had a really interesting conversation about this. What do you think the role of science is, or what needs to happen for more accessible and more ethical practices?
I think that notion of designing with disabled people and having lived experience at the very earliest part of a process is so integral or important. Every now and again, what you will find, depending on the social media platform that you're on, is a new innovation for a wheelchair user to be able to get upstairs. And they look like a transformer. Have you seen it? And people are like, wow. I'm like, we could just fix the stairs? How much does that robot cost? How many of them are there? And it's that need to find the balance between innovation, progress, and systems that we are constantly trying to solve the body, the person, and there are absolutely necessary scientific and medical-based innovations that are required for that. But sometimes we are lured by whether it's the market model or whether it is the ability to innovate, rather than thinking about, we should just change the stairs. And I think that's a balance. We were talking about this earlier. You know, there is a new drug that exists from BioMarin around achondroplasia. And the idea of it is that it is given to children with achondroplasia in their youth to turn the growth receptors back on. The envision of it was to reduce pain in adulthood, but not every condition is the same or experiences it. And what it mostly intends or may do is transform the visibility of a person having dwarfism. But what do we then look like as a society? Is somebody only visibly having dwarfism if they're from an intergenerational family. And I think it's about where's the balance in terms of finding the solutions that need to be solved, and pain is absolutely a treatment that is required, but what's the why? And where does our ego sit within it? And our ego to be innovators rather than actually solving problems through a more equitable perspective.
Yeah.
It's my sense.
Thank you.
We have questions.
Do we have
Hello,
questions?
please use the microphone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We have one over here.
Go ahead.
Okay, cool. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm taken, still trying to process. And I love that you're advocating for the idea that it's all an us, like it's us being disabled or maybe just not normal.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you look at people who are not wishing to self-identify as disabled,
Yeah.
how can you include them at all stages? I'm wondering especially about hiring processes and that sort of thing, because you can, of course, explicitly ask for needs, requirements, all sorts of things. But what if someone just has the self-perception of saying, no, I'm able as much as I can, and you want me, you just don't know it yet. So how can we include these people if they don't want to slap a label on themselves?
So just to reiterate that question for the room in terms of volume, I know the sound booth, I think, was trying to hire it up there. So the question was, how do we create space to include people who are not yet comfortable or may never be comfortable self-identifying as disabled and see themselves kind of through an able-bodied lens? And I think you were right, you know, I'm boldly standing up here on stage with a microphone attached to my head, telling you that you're the solution. Surprise, you're one of the solutions. But I think it's about realizing that there is always only a limit as to what we can do, and personal agency and choice and flexibility is absolutely necessary. What we know from other identity groups as well, right? It's Pride Month. Not everybody in the queer community even feels a relationship to that language, and that must be respected on an individual level. I think if somebody doesn't identify as disabled and you still do the work to ensure that their access requirements are met is incredibly important, and creating space to include them. But we have to be open to the fact that some people may never, and that's due to societal biases, but also personal choice. The way I think about it is, if there was no vegetarians or vegans here, I would still ask everyone if they had dietary requirements, just in case. So if you kind of take that practice and approach that you're setting up places and systems to be a bit more equitable, but creating the opportunity that not everybody will want to or has to identify as disabled. Does that make sense? Yeah. Sure, I'm going to repeat what she says. So she said there's another step to the process, that how do you continue to include them in terms of the process? I think there's only so much that you can do, right? So if you're trying to have a greater diversity of lived experience as part of a process, let's use a name. If you have a sense that Sam is dyslexic, Sam hasn't told you that they are dyslexic, but you would like to include somebody dyslexic in the process, it gets a bit challenging when you make assumptions or requirements for their needs. So I think it's also about creating space, and also there should never be one. So if there's another dyslexic person as part of the process, it may be easier for Sam to participate. Does that make sense? But I think we should never use people based on identities they have, because it serves our need, that it is about building a broader landscape.
Thank you. We have a question over here at the front.
Hello. Thank you. Oh.
We're just waiting for the microphone.
I think it's working now. I'm also losing my voice, so that may be why. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very enlightening. I have the feeling, you talk a lot about discomfort, that there are disability that we are okay with, that we are comfortable with, and other that are more complicated for us in terms of comfort. And when we think about access, we will include those first, and you said it yourself. How can we challenge that inside our institutions?
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Je parle un peu de France, mais c'est tout. I'm not going to answer that in French because that will be really troubling. Merci. I think that's a great question. So the question that was asked is, we often have a comfort level with specific types of disabilities or experiences, and when we think about our access strategy, we think about those needs before any others. So how do we think more broadly? One of the greatest ways into thinking about accessibility meaningfully is multiple format. So let's even think about a brochure for an exhibition. Is it available in multiple languages? Is it available in large print format? Is it in Braille? Is there an audio version? Is it available in digital? So in terms of trying to think through a multi-format lens, it often gives you a way into thinking through that. But I think it is also not through a perspective of tokenism, continuously asking yourself, who are we still not including? And to your point, we will often think about a wheelchair user's access. We will often think about having access for a deaf person, sometimes somebody who's blind or low vision. We rarely think about those who have learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities. How do they engage in a process? What does agency look like, and what does consent look like around those categories of disability and those people? That doesn't give us an excuse to not participate, because once again, we are multiply marginalizing those who are multiply marginalized. The best advice that I could give you within that space is broaden out your supplier network. Who are the disability-led organizations? And I think that's a good caveat to make, that often when we think about inclusion of disabled people, our first step is charity. But how does that frame the entire conversation when this is about a charitable effort out of need rather than rights, justice, and access? So if there are disability-led organizations either within your environment, or I'm sure there are collective forums internally in here that people have resources that you could lean on, I would absolutely engage in that. An organization that you might look to that's US-based is called Sins Invalid, and they do some really great work about those who experience mental illness in a way that institutions are often not very comfortable with. But that's what I would look to, and constantly challenge yourself, because a ramp is easy, and we still don't do it.
Thank you, Sinead.
There's a question down the back.
Yep, great, thank you.
Hello.
Okay, thank you. I'm Kati from Heureka, Finland. Thank you for your speech. It was remarkable. I think that one of the most barriers in our way to access is really language. At Heureka, we have used in some exhibitions so-called clear Finnish, and we have found out that it helps also those who don't really, it is not planned to be. Yes. So teachers, parents love to read instructions so that they are very clear.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we, this is a question, like not question, shouldn't we actually decide to use a certain amount from the exhibition budget to use this? I mean, we can use million euros to an exhibition, and then we are saying that we can't afford.
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I think the question there was around plain language and how do we do that. I mean, I'm sure all of you have family members who are not in the industries that you are in. Do you ever talk to them about your work? Do you ever almost lose the will to live with their what? What? Huh? So if we to think about plain language, I think is so integral and important, and it goes back to the multiple formats. Often when we think about making museums or culture or science accessible, again, what do we mean by that? So if you had to distill in a very simplified way, simplified that isn't patronizing, that doesn't undermine your own expertise, I think having plain language available would be absolutely key, and that could be something that you include on a checklist. We have a couple of checklists that we work with in order to be able to make things procedural, to be able to create access, but I think plain language is a great one. Thank you. Glad to hear Finland are doing it. We have a question here.
Can I maybe ask you before we go to another question? You mentioned our responsibility to imagine what access could look like, and you mentioned co-design, and I wanted to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit on what co-design means to you. What does true co-design look like? And
yeah, I think as we talk about that principle of nothing about us without us, what we have seen is a real move to co-design. But I often wonder whose expertise gets to be valued. I participated in a hackathon about 6 or 7 years ago, where engineers, where chemists, scientists followed me around a city for a day and were like, oh, what does access look like for you? And
Terrifying.
Yeah, it was pretty terrifying. And we ended up redesigning the ATM machine because it's not accessible for anybody. It's incredibly difficult. And when the product and the project was finished, who owned the idea? It wasn't me. It was those who are non-disabled looking through innovation through that lens. Does that make sense? So in terms of co-design, I think it has to be built in from the very beginning. It's about that individual or individuals having as much decision-making power as everybody else, and the idea that expertise and lived experience are the same thing, and that you may have an expertise in academia or in science or in culture, but the lived experience is an expertise in and of its right, and we must value that. I think it's also about financially valuing that process. Often anybody who is different or other is encouraged to be part of research or studies or programs because, like, we're making your lives better, so why wouldn't you want to be part of it? And often that experience isn't valued, so you have full-time researchers, full-time scientists, full-time museum professionals engaging in a project, asking people with lived experience to participate voluntarily because you're solving their problem, which is just not very economical or equitable. So how do we redraft that? But I think it is about having decision-making at the top and having almost two people, in terms of one from the institution, one from external, leading the project from the outset.
Yeah.
That's difficult to engage in, but co-design often doesn't give the authorship or value the experience of the othered perspective.
Great, yeah, it's a real challenge. We have maybe one more question here in the center. Yeah.
Your PhD student wants to ask a question. But go first, go.
Oh, thank you. I've been rummaging the idea or the comment you made about the stairs and the robot. And in many of these institutions, we have exhibitions that were made a long time ago. They're not accessible. Or, for example, there are topics like optical illusions that are challenging. You're not going to take it out because they're not for people with visual disabilities, but what can we do? Perhaps putting a signage of, this is not a place for you, you can go to this other place, being creative on having tactile illusions as well, right? So what are the things that you cannot throw away,
Sure.
right? And the things that you need to adapt, and the things that you need to throw away, right? Like doing some triage, maybe.
And the balance?
Yeah.
Great question. So I think signage and communication is incredibly important. I think communicating why something may not be for someone. You know, what we're seeing more and more is spaces closed off that has visual stimulus that may be triggering for someone with epilepsy, for example. And that place will be curtained off and say, if flashing lights is inaccessible to you, please don't enter into this space, in terms of a caveat. Being really clear about that so it's not a surprise to others is really important. I would also do an audit of those past exhibitions. So if we now know that, like what you were speaking to in terms of that visual stimulus is no longer accessible, and that may have been satisfactory and fine 15 years ago, ensure that there's a commitment internally to not recommission something like that. Because whilst we can't, to your point, throw it out. Now, my argument boldly would be, do it, throw it out, but I'm not paying the bills. How do we not reiterate those processes, and how do we, in terms of anything that you're engaging with, set a limitation or set a bunch of criteria that artists or exhibitors or creators have to meet in order to engage with you, so that forever on, you're not continuously coming up with those barriers. Because if we don't learn from the past, we are just setting ourselves up not to support those who need that to succeed. So I think communications is really important. And I do think it's about being really transparent and honest about what exists. And I do think that there are moments when there should be some sort of reckoning. And I know that cultural institutions are having this conversation about intersectionality more broadly, about what actually gets to belong. You know, we're having great conversations around VR and AR at the moment. That's not accessible. the metaverse is not accessible. Do you know why? There's nobody disabled designing it. So how do you think about the future through that past category and lexicon and keep improving? And I would also record it, because I imagine in 10 years you will all move to different institutions. I would ask, what do you want your legacy to be? And how can you begin to create a track record and a path for that internally, so that whoever succeeds you in whatever role you're in can continue that progression? Does that make sense? There was one other question here.
Yeah, I think we'll take just this one last one, and then I think we have to wrap up. So, Sophie?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so important to hear and just incredible, amazing. I was really interested to hear a bit more on your reflection of your work in like the formal schooling sector, specifically in Ireland, I guess. I think obviously lots of us like cross or work in the non-formal, but we also exist as like this educational system.
Yeah.
And how do we kind of talk about disability in schools and set like how are young disabled people welcomed or not welcomed or stigmatized as early as like their schooling experiences, and is there any what's happening in that sector?
I think that's such an interesting question. You know, in Ireland we have, within the second level education, kind of two sections. We have junior certificate and leaving certificate, which then you go on to college. I didn't do science for my leaving cert because there was some questions or concerns about whether or not my eyebrows would be singed with the Bunsen burner and the height of the table. Right? So let's think about equipment, supply chain, design of spaces and classrooms. All of that is part of who then gets to participate in a career in science, for example. In terms of how do you teach children about disability, often a way in is through culture. So I think it's challenging putting yourself in the position, if you are non-disabled, being the expert. But what you can do is go to picture books, go to sex education on Netflix, depending on their age, and use that material that exists to be able to talk to those stories and provide that representation. But I think it's also holding space. What we know from that youngest of generation through TikTok and various other platforms is they're probably more informed about correct language or more progressive language and conversations than most of us who are older than them. So creating space for them to be the experts. When I was a teacher, we used to do this program called Mantle of the Expert, where the children themselves sat in the position of expertise, and you as the adult had to narrate the fictional world in order for them to be able to step up, which was really great in poor communities because a lack of confidence was such a challenge to success and progress. But I think it is about creating space, and I think it's about putting them in a position of power. My greatest learning in the classroom was teaching maths. I had 11 and 12-year-old boys in the inner city who saw no value for maths whatsoever and found it really difficult, particularly long division and long multiplication. So coming from a working class background myself, I understood how important home was. So I used to bring the local takeout and takeaway menu into school, and I'd tell them the story of Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, and they'd look at me going, "Does she know that she's small?" And I was like, "I'm aware." And I would tell them that Snow White and Prince Charming has gone on a last-minute date, that we need to buy food for the Seven Dwarfs while they're out dating, but because they're 7 cis straight men, they're fussy. So they can't have the same food because it'll be chaos when it eventually arrives. One is a vegan, one is a vegetarian, one is paleo, one doesn't like chicken. So for those students who had greater educational attainment, they were able to work independently on that task. And I sat with those who were really challenged educationally. And one of the boys who often experienced, or who I experienced through him, some incredibly difficult behavior, I said to him, "Let's just work out the chips." He was like, "Cool. 1 bag is $2.50, 2 bags are $5." Like, there's always that moment as the educator in the room where you're like, "God, I'm amazing." And I said to him, I was like, "Wow, like, you did it," and wrote the multiplication on the board. And he was like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Maths. You just did maths." He said, "No, I did dinner." And we can laugh at that, but he was being entirely sincere because he was continuously code switching between home and school. He didn't see the relevance of maths in the classroom to his real life because if children understand anything, they understand money. And I think as educators and as science communicators, having the humility to realize the expertise in the room, be it they 4 or they 12, and creating space for their world, continuously bringing that in, has what's always set me up for success. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mairead.
Ladies and gentlemen, Folks, let's give a huge, warm, excite thank you and welcome to Sinead Burke.